I'm from Visualise, and I just want to start off by saying that I feel really excited to be here and excited to be here at YouTube talking about VR because I think that it's pretty amazing that a massive company like Google is taking VR so seriously. Everybody that works in the VR industry wants VR to succeed as a platform and as a thing. And the fact that such a massive company with such enormous resources is getting behind it is just really exciting for anybody that's working in the field. Sorry, I'm just trying to here we go. I'm going to be talking about respecting your viewer today. I'm going to be talking a lot about comfort in VR today. And how comfort really is one of the cornerstones of creating a great VR experience. So, who are Visualise? Well, we're based in London. We're based roughly around the corner over in Shoreditch. And we've been producing VR content since around 2012. We got the first Oculus Rift dev kit. We'd been shooting 360 photos and videos for a while before VR was sort of a new thing. Since then, the growth of the company has just been amazing, and the projects that we've been able to work on have just been, increasingly are just getting incredible. I think the one thing that separates Visualise from other VR production companies is that we only produce VR. So we're not like a big VFX house that produces VR on the side, or a television production company that's getting into VR. We focus solely on creating VR contents. And along with that, we also use our entire workflow, and everything that we do is all done in-house. So we try and work on the entire pipeline of everything from acquisition to post-production, VFX, and all those things. These are some of the people that we've worked with over the years. Some of our clients. So the big challenge, making great VR. I mean, that's I think why everybody's here today. We're talking about VR content. Comfort is super, super important to VR. And the reason why comfort is so important is because in a lot of ways, we believe that comfort enables presence. I mean, we've been talking about presence a little bit today, but presence, just to give another kind of example and an analogy of presence, is if you're in a VR experience and you're standing right next to a cliff face and you're looking down and you get that kind of sinking feeling, that's your brain going, wait a second, there's danger down here. Even though on a conscious level you know that there's not actually danger there, presence is more of a kind of physical phenomenon that happens to your senses when you're in a VR experience. So the reason that comfort enables presence is because if you're not comfortable in the experience, it's a lot harder to submit yourself to that experience. It's a lot harder to lose yourself inside of a VR experience if the camera's moving around and there's a lot of extreme things happening. On the other side of the spectrum is engagement. So this is, what is the story? Who are the characters? Is the setting interesting? All of these kinds of things add towards a feeling of engagement. And when you combine a feeling of presence with engagement, that's great VR. So this is great VR. This guy's super happy about that. So we work with a lot of brands, and all of our clients want great VR. The problem is that all of our clients want a 360 POV of Usain Bolt sprinting down a track. The challenge is that this is not comfortable, and so this does not equal great VR. So how do we take these ideas of comfort and apply them into a situation where we can achieve comfort and still have motion sub movement and stuff? So how do we achieve this? Well, the first thing we usually do when we get a brief in for a first-person POV experience where there's a lot of motion is we tell them to not do it. We tell them that there's so much that you can do in VR with a static camera where the action and the story and other things are happening around the viewer. The first thing to think about is to just keep it stable. You don't need to move the camera around necessarily. I'm going to talk about the meat hook principle for a second here, because this is getting into the realm of if you're going to move the camera, how do you do it? So the meat hook principle, I think is a term that was coined by Tom Forsyth from Oculus a few years ago. And so imagine you got a big meat hook and you've like hooked a guy in the back of his head, and you've lifted him up off the ground. His body's going to be moving all over the place, but his head is going to be completely stationary. This is a really important principle in comfort in VR. You can't introduce any kind of extra head movement or head motion into the shot, because that instantly leads to viewer discomfort. So in VR, for comfort, for production, you really need to think about how you can separate the head from the body. It's not that easy to do, but we've come up with a couple of pretty novel solutions for how to do this. This is an example that we shot for Audi, and it's a first-person POV shot in a car. And what we did was we rigged a really small 360 camera with some rigging in the back of the car, which we removed in post, to allow the driver to sit there and drive, but so that none of the motion from the driver's head was mapped into this shot. So if you want to play that, we'll just take a look at that. As it's moving around, we just recorded this with a mouse, so it's kind of jittering a little bit, but in the experience, it's perfectly smooth when you look around. So you can see that it gives a pretty accurate representation of what it's like to be driving this car. So this is another piece that we did for a theater group called, actually the piece is called In Her Shoes. And this is to try and simulate the experience of having a epileptic seizure. So if you want to play that as well. We used a similar technique for this where we got some characters really close to the camera and they're looking at you and it's very engaging, which I'll talk about in a second. But this is comfortable. This is first-person POV. You can look down and see the other person's body, and this works pretty well. It'll be done in just a second. You can sort of, yeah. Okay, so what happens when you can't separate the camera from the person's body? Well, when that happens, what you need to do is you need to stabilize the crap out of it. Basically, so if you want to play this one, this is a shot that we did for the Finnish national ski team. And so that's a camera strapped to that skier's head, and he's going down the hill. But what we did was we used a software package called Nuke to do a large amount of stabilization to make this shot actually fairly comfortable to watch when you're sitting in a chair. When I first watched this shot, it was just unwatchably uncomfortable. The camera was bouncing, the skier's head was turning like this. But after going through this stabilization process, it worked pretty well. So this technique was actually so effective that the Foundry, who makes Nuke, invited us to do a couple of talks about it. And that workflow for stabilization is going to be incorporated into Nuke, into their VR tools in the future. Finally, this is another example that I particularly like. Oops, sorry. If you want to play this one, thanks. It's another example that I really like. So this is shot with a 360 camera mounted on a long pole with a gyro stabilizer attached to the other end of the pole. And this is a really good way of giving a first-person POV perspective while still maintaining a lot of smooth motion in one direction. You'll see me in a second there carrying it. So I'm actually dressed as though I'm part of the scene. And you can't really see where the camera is like attaching into my hand, but it's still, if you can give up the fact that the operator is going to be in there, it still is a pretty effective way of doing a shot where you're moving through an environment, which is important. For all other kinds of shots, if there's going to be motion, you got to make it smooth. If you're going to be moving at all, make it smooth, make it in one direction going forward. Don't move backwards, don't turn around corners and stuff like that. We use a lot of dollies in a lot of the shoots that we do. That's a gyro-stabilized dolly. Well, there's a gyro on the bottom of it, and the dolly is moving through environments. That's a pretty good way of shooting. We use a lot of drones in the shooting that we do, and we're always careful when we're flying the drones to make them, straight, level, constant, consistent motion. Next, you got to use the right tools for the job. There's a jump camera there. It's really hilarious, actually, that they used an example. This is an example of like a bad 360 camera, and they've already used the same image. But I guess on Google image search, I just sort of saw this camera, and I was like, this is not an ideal camera for shooting in so many ways. They actually mounted it to a helicopter and flew it. You could achieve a really similar shot with a drone. So it's a little bit overkill. I thought. I'm going to talk really briefly about 360 audio, but this is a critically important part of VR production. Audio adds enormously to a feeling of immersion. And this is a picture of a prototype microphone that Sennheiser's develops, and we're working with them a little bit on figuring out the workflow for ambisonic audio. And there still is so much to be done with audio in VR that hasn't been done yet, but definitely a critically important thing. Another thing to consider if you're producing this content is don't be afraid of lighting a scene. Lighting is a hugely important part of regular filmmaking, but not a lot of 360 video content has had a really nice treatment of lighting in it. So this is a shot from an internal project that we're working on, which is a documentary about people that live in Spitalfields. And there is actually a lot of lighting in this scene, but we we composited out a lot of the lighting elements, and we did a lot of little tricks like hiding a really powerful light in there and stuff like that. But yeah, so again, lighting is a super critical kind of thing. So we've got all this stuff about comfort and how comfort, relates to presence and how comfort is so important. But the other side of making great VR is how do we make it engaging? How do we tell a really good story in VR? This is uncharted territory, basically. I mean, people are trying different things in the VR landscape for creating interesting stories, but nobody really knows yet how to do it. And that's kind of part of the problem, is that I really believe that you need to know the rules before you can break them. And if you don't really know the rules, because we don't know all the rules yet, then for us, the approach for creating VR content that we really focus on all the time is to simplify. So many pieces of VR that I've watched are trying to do too much, and because they're trying to do too much, and because those rules aren't really so well understood, the best approach, we think, to making it good is to keep it simple. And this is actually an article that came out on Ars Technica earlier this week. And the article talks about Sundance and the films that are at Sundance, and actually takes quite a critical view of a lot of these films that were shown at Sundance. And I thought this article was really, really good, because it's one of the first times that a mainstream journalist publication, tech publication, has actually talked about, okay, so we can make VR. We know we can make VR. So what are the problems with it? It's not just all great. I mean, there's a lot that we could do better. So this kind of comes back to the idea that we always go for keeping it simple. So I'll just read it in case you can't read it at the back. So the film Hard World for Small Things presents 4 conversations in parallel, all of which require looking away from one to see and hear the other. This doesn't play out in a compelling, the noise is the sum of all parts manner. Instead, it sees a great concept slamming headfirst into the realities of current VR headsets, in which viewpoints are choked into tiny fields of view, and comfort suffers as a result. So effectively, what he's saying here in the rest of the article is that the filmmakers had an awesome concept, but what they did was they presented all these different things happening all the time, and that alienates the viewer a lot. One thing that we try and do when we're setting up a shot for 360 is, we always try and concentrate the action in front of the viewer. You don't have to place things all around the viewer and force them to look around all the time to kind of follow what's going on. It's a lot more immersive if you're always faced towards the thing that you should be faced towards, because in regular everyday life, you're always facing towards the thing that you're engaged in. So we try and concentrate the action in front of the viewer. And don't make the viewer work too hard to find the story. Along with that, try not to present multiple story beats simultaneously. This sort of goes back as well to not having too many conversations going on all at the same time, and just keeping everything focused and simplified. Lastly, don't cut too frequently. I mean, I could probably spend a couple of hours talking about editing in VR, and it's the thing I think that I've learned in editing a lot of pieces of content that we've created is, you really need to give the viewer time to adjust to what they're seeing and to adjust to where they are. It works kind of like how reality works. I mean, if I could teleport any one of you somewhere, you would need time to understand where you had just been teleported to. You need time to look around and take in who's there and what's there and all those kinds of things. And a lot of cases, a lot of content that I see, there's cuts like every 4 seconds, and it's like, okay, I'm seeing something. Okay, now there's the next thing. Okay, now there's the next thing. And it's like, just slow down, slow down. I mean, as a minimum, we would say 10 seconds, but if I had my way more of the time, it would be like 20 or 30 seconds per shot or per location that the camera's in. The last thing I want to talk about here is probably the most important thing out of all of this stuff, and that is something that VR is very, very good at, and that you don't have to work very hard to achieve, and that is enabling emotional connections. So you can put somebody in a VR experience, and if you sit them down next to another person and have that other person that you're recording just tell a story to the camera, this can make for a very immersive but very kind of one-to-one experience between you and the other person that's in the footage. And it goes back to keeping it simple. You don't have to work very hard in VR to enable an emotional connection. And that's something that something that is capable in VR of happening that is not really capable, it's not really likely to happen in any other medium in the same way. So I want to show you guys, just before I finish up here, a piece that we're working on right now. It's still sort of a work in progress. We're doing a pretty large project for Doctors Without Borders. And so over the course of this year, I'm going to be traveling all over the world to refugee camps, shooting things and interviewing people and stuff. And I just got back from Tanzania a couple weeks ago. And so I want to show just a kind of a teaser clip of this project. But I think that this clip kind of embodies a lot of what I'm talking about. There's a good emotional connection. The editing is slow enough. And I think that the point of the piece comes across pretty well.
Hi, I'm George Hunter. I'm a psychologist here at Nduta Camp. Also worked at Niragusu at our kind of the sister camp down the road, and I'm in charge of the mental health activities here. We have a mental health team that works throughout the camp and in the hospital and health facilities here. The whole situation, I guess, for me as a psychologist, the thing that I find stunning is just the scale of it and the fact that it doesn't seem to be really on anybody's radar, at least not in a tremendous way. We have a couple 100,000 people here, and they've all suffered enormous trauma, and they're all having emotional difficulties. They're all having all sorts of problems, and it's really just playing catch up. As you can imagine, they've really lost everything. I mean, these are people who maybe 6 months ago were living at home in a city. Their kids were going to school. They were getting up in the morning and going to work. Now they live in a tent. Most of them have nothing. They've been forced to flee. They've seen really horrible things, terrible violence in a lot of cases. In many cases, they've lost family members, they've lost friends. We have a young computer technician in one of the other camps, and he asked me a while ago, he said, what do people in the US think about what's going on in Burundi now? What do they think about these camps and everyone having to live like this? And I really didn't have a good answer for that, because the answer is that most people are completely unaware of it. Not only do they not have an opinion about it, they don't even know that it's occurring. I really didn't have the heart to tell him that, so I guess the message that I would have is that find out about this place.
Okay. Thanks. So I guess we're going to do a Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes for Q&A. The mic is just down here. Okay, so he's got some questions. All right, let me chuck it to you.
Hi, that was fantastic, thank you. I'm interested in, we make fiction projects, so we make scripted projects, and the way you describe best practice in terms of, keep the camera still, keep the action in front of the camera, sounds like sounds like stereo rather than 360 in terms of what the best practice is. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the 360 element evolving, or if you think that for things like fiction or movies, you think it will essentially remain a stereo phenomenon, or maybe I've slightly misunderstood?
Do you say stereo in terms of just a regular frame, like a regular?
Well, yeah,
frame?
That's right. So if you've got all the action happening in front of the camera and the
Right.
camera is static, essentially what you're seeing is a 3D image of something happening in front of you, which could be achieved with two cameras next to each other rather than the full array. Because it sounds from what you're saying like that would be a mistake to use that capability.
You can use it sometimes. I think that if you're in an experience and it's a really good experience, it's an immersive experience, you're able to look around, and you're not always so aware of the fact that you're able to look around, but the fact that you can, and that you know that you're in this experience and that you can, if the experience is good, it's allowing you to kind of sink into it. So even if the action of what the director wants the viewer to see is happening right in front of the person that's wearing the headset, they still are going to feel immersed in that environment because they have the freedom of choice to look around. It's kind of like a simplification of how you actually interact with the world itself, because you're always turning towards something that you're interested in. But I don't think that means necessarily that if you just keep everything in front, that VR filmmaking can't really evolve past where it is now, because you can use everything else if you want to, but just use it sparingly. Don't make the viewer work way too hard to see things that are happening and going on. Thanks. Next person.
Hi. I was really interested to hear about the work that you're doing with Doctors Without Borders. I presume that's a fundraising piece, or that's so I think that's really interesting. What do you think is the single most exciting kind of untapped opportunity for VR?
Oh, I think there's so many untapped opportunities in narrative filmmaking. A lot of VR that's been created has been more of the documentary style of things. And a lot of the narrative pieces that have been made, I think, fall into the trap that I sort of pointed out before, that there's a lot happening, and so that kind of disengages the viewer. But I mean, something that I really want to see is just a really simple story where you're there with a character in an environment, and the character is not really aware that you're there, but the character is just very expressive and everything. There's so much potential there, in a narrative sense, and I haven't even seen anything that really even scratches the beginnings of that yet. So we still got a really long way to go.
A quick technical question instead.
Sure.
Despite the montage was pretty quick in moving from one scene from another, I've seen you don't use you have used fading the scenes one from another instead of cutting. Was that the result of some A/B testing to see what made them more comfortable to the user?
I think it was maybe less the result of A/B testing and more just the result of a lot of experimentation with editing. So I edit most of the pieces that Visualise produces, and I just feel like you need to transition gently, There is actually one hard cut at the end of this, and the reason I left the hard cut at the end was because I wanted to kind of snap you back into what he was saying. But most of the time, the transitions I want to be as gradual and as smooth as possible, because you're physically, if you think about it in a spatial sense, you're physically moving the viewer to another place. You're not just like cutting an image in front of them. So that transition should be as kind of unnoticeable as possible, but the thing is that it's always going to be noticeable because you're like, okay, I'm in a new place now. So that's kind of the thinking behind that.
It was very interesting about the audio, because I guess that as humans we're not already ready for like 360 entertainment. It's a little bit too much for us.
Exactly, and that's another reason why simplification is so important, because the viewers aren't used to what you're trying to do yet to begin with. So if you keep it simple, they'll be able to follow what's going on more easily.